In this video, I'll demonstrate placing a chest tube with a trochar stylet into a cadaver. This dog is in right lateral recumbency. He's draped. First, we need to estimate the point of insertion in the skin relative to the point of insertion through the intercostal space. And I've located the 13th rib and the 9th inner space. We're going to want a long subcutaneous tunnel to serve as a barrier for air entry into the pleural space when we're done. While I'm looking at the 9th intercostal space, my assistant is going to pull the skin forward as far as practical, which is difficult on a cadaver, and I'm going to relocate that 9th intercostal space and block the skin, subcu, and muscle all the way down to the pleura right at that location. We already know this dog has a pneumothorax, so I can be fairly cavalier about how far the needle goes in. I'll confirm that I'm in the pleural space by aspirating air and inject lidocaine on the way out. I scratch a very light X onto the skin at the point where it's blocked, and that X will wheel up on a live patient following prep to let me relocate the skin blocked site. I'm also going to do a nerve block at the neurovascular bundle on the caudal edge of that rib and the rib behind and in front of that 9th intercostal space. This will give me kind of a maximal degree of potential block and anesthesia for the procedure. We typically do this on awake dogs. I'll often do it with the dog in sternal recumbency or standing, whichever they prefer, and a good nerve block is essential. Now we've had time for the block to set up. My assistant is drawing the skin forward again. I'm relocating the blocked area by having the assistant move the skin X mark over that 9th intercostal space. I went ahead and made a small incision through the skin, large enough to accommodate the tube, and by using blunt dissection with a curved 4-inch hemostat, I'm going to try to bluntly dissect right down to the pleura. That's easier said than done, and it's common to accidentally puncture through the pleura. If that happens, don't withdraw the hemostat. Make sure you keep it in place and trade it out with the tube. I'll now estimate the depth I want to place this 20 French trochar catheter, and I'll choose 18 centimeters at the rib site. Holding it like a pencil, I pop it through the pleura. Then holding the trochar stationary, I'll start advancing the catheter off the trochar into the chest cavity, keeping the trochar as parallel to the chest wall as practical to help guide the catheter between the chest wall and the lung until I'm into the depth that I want it to be. Because my adapter is smaller than the flange of the tube, I've cut part of the tube off prior to connecting it to the flange. Push those two firmly together, and I'll proceed to anchor the tube. So I'm withdrawing the skin, and that 18 centimeter mark is at the intercostal space, and the skin is pulled back to the more caudal aspect of the chest tube. And I need to place 3 sets of sutures. The first closes the skin wound. If the skin wound is slightly larger than the tube, then I'll need to snug this up to close the wound. Do not put a purse string suture in here, and this suture should in no way anchor the tube itself. This is simply there to close the skin gently around the tube. If the hole's not too big, you can get by with just 1 suture. If you made the hole too generous, you may need 2 simple interrupted sutures like I'm going to have to do on this animal. I've placed the second suture, and now I'm putting in the second goal, which is a single cerclage suture around the tube as close to the point of insertion through the chest wall as possible. Because I dissected through the intercostal muscles, that wound is larger than the diameter of the chest tube, and if I don't snug the tissue up around the tube, I've got the possibility for air or fluid to leak into the subcutaneous space. So this suture is double-aught monofilament nylon, and it's just there to snug the tunnel up against the tube to prevent leakage of air or liquid from the chest cavity into the subcutaneous space. The final suture is going to anchor the tube to the dog, and for this I use number 2 monofilament nylon, or whatever the heaviest suture you have in your practice. Decide how I'd like the tube to lie once I'm done, and then grab a good section of skin directly under the tube with this suture materials needle. Pull equally long ends out of that bite and complete a square knot that forms a snug but not tight loop on the skin. This loop should not put any pressure on the skin within it, so it's snugged up to the skin basically, and this is going to serve as an anchor for our tube. So I don't have a very secure knot there, so I'm going to put in a couple more throws. This knot needs to be very secure so I can pull against it very firmly without strangulating the skin within the loop. Next, I'll put a surgeon's throw on and crimp down very tightly on the tube at the location I want, and then wrap both ends of the suture around the tube in opposite direction 2 times before tying my next square knot. This is going to form a cross pattern, and you'd like each crossing section of suture to be equidistant from each other, and you'd like that distance to be roughly equal to the diameter of the tube. That'll prevent these crosses and knotted areas from migrating up or down the tube. This is often erroneously referred to as a Chinese finger trap. In fact, this is going to be a string of knots. A finger trap would allow the tube to move in one direction but not another, and we don't really want this tube to move in or out. We want it held relatively stationary compared to the location where it enters the skin. Do this as many times as the length of suture allows. For demonstration purposes here, I'm just going to do one more double loop around and tie a final square knot here. And that's generally going to be enough to hold the tube. This needs to be really tight enough to crimp this very stiff tube. That's why the largest suture you have is really important. This number 2 monofilament nylon works really good for this purpose. The final thing I'm going to do is put wire cerclage around that Christmas tree adapter where it's inserted into the chest tube to firmly hold that in place. So using the same technique you'd use for cerclage wire around a fracture, we'll place this double loop of cerclage wire and fold the twisted end down on the tube. As a final safety measure, I'll put a clamp on the chest tube itself, and when we're not actively aspirating the chest tube, particularly if it's not hooked up to a continuous suction device, we'll clamp it like that. An alternative is to put an adapter on the chest tube that it has an integrated clamp. This particular adapter by Mila has a lure fitting at the end. Because I cut part of the flange off of this chest tube, it doesn't fit in optimally, but I can get enough of it in that I've got a couple of grooves to put a cerclage wire around to hold it securely in place. So I'll use the same technique to apply a cerclage here. And once my wire is drawn tight, bend that spiral down to get it out of the way. And now I've got a extension set that's got a clamp and a stopcock on it that will allow me to hook up a syringe for intermittent aspiration or a continuous suction apparatus through a IV tubing extension piece like so.